Hello and welcome to Ahval Podcasts, the home of objective, up-to-date and independent reporting on Turkey. Don't forget to follow our reports through social media, on ahvalnews.com or through our mobile app. Let's get started.
Hello, welcome to Ahval Podcasts. I am Hala Akay and today our guest is Seth Frantzman, the Middle East analyst of the Jerusalem Post and also the author of the book After ISIS, America, Iran and the Struggle for the Middle East. Hello and thanks for joining us, Mr. Frantzman.
Thank you for having me.
So you wrote a very interesting article last week in the Jerusalem Post saying that Turkey's leadership has become crisis hungry. May I first ask you what you mean by that? Why do you think that the Turkish government at the moment thrives on some constant crisis strategy?
Well, I think if you read the newspapers every day, Turkey seems to be every single day threatening one of its neighbors or threatening some other country in the region, or trying to claim that it's going to blackmail NATO or the EU or the United States. So clearly the country every day, especially its top leadership, feels that this is the best way to drive to politics domestically and foreign policy. I mean, I don't think there's any other country in the world that every single day is involved in so many different threats. Even threats it doesn't carry out, but threats always saying it's going to do this or that, whether it's closing this American airbase at Incirlik or signing some new deal with Libya or sending drones to Cyprus. And that's just in the last few days. And then there's always Syria, Iraq, Israel, or some new deal with the Russians or something else. So it's obvious that the country increasingly is involved in trying to stoke these crises. And also that obviously the leadership feels that it gains by this, because you can see in every single speech or TV interview, I don't think any world leader gives so many public speeches as much as Recep Tayyip Erdogan. So obviously the leader thinks that this is a very successful strategy. And it seems to be a key part of Turkey's foreign policy, a country that, by the way, not so long ago used to talk about zero problems with its neighbors. It now seems to have problems with all of its neighbors. So it's a bit alarming, but I think it's also very clear that the country thinks that they're benefiting from this in some way.
So when reading your article, I also remembered other things. Like this year, we also had some diplomatic crisis with New Zealand and Iceland. So the country is really at a strange place, obviously. You say also in the article that that crisis strategy works very well for domestic reasons for Erdogan. Why do you think so?
Well, it seems that the AKP has been in power now for something like 13 years, and that the party seems to thrive on always trying to find new enemies. So it used to be conspiracies amongst the generals, and then it was the claim that there is a Gulen conspiracy. Then, of course, there was the coup attempt, and then, of course, the war with the PKK. So internally, the country seems to also have, prior to trying to stoke all these foreign crises, internally there was always some new crisis over the last 13 years. Now, what's interesting is this seems to be that in terms of foreign policy, the government has realized that the more times that you can claim that Turkey's involved in some new drones or missile programs, or it's going to throw the Americans out, or it's going to threaten the EU, apparently this is very good for at least some portion of Turkey, which is more far-right or right-wing nationalists. And I think that if you look at the last elections, the AKP has been very concerned that its vote count is going down, especially as it tends to even find that some of its former founders or leading officials are leaving the party. So it needs to find some way to get those voters back. And there is, of course, a strong nationalist element in Turkey that is not just AKP, but is other parties as well. So the more that the government says that it's going to threaten Cyprus, threaten Greece, threaten the Kurds, the PKK, or the United States, or Europe, it seems that fuels a kind of cycle in which large numbers of people, at least especially on social media, are kind of galvanized. And I know that if anyone who spends any time on social media sees that there is a kind of outpouring of this kind of Turkish nationalism combined with a bit of religious nationalism, or feeling somehow that Turkey is going to get back all of this pride or something that it apparently thinks that the government thinks it lost in the 1980s or 90s or something.
Again, in your article, you say that Turkey is uniquely positioned to exploit these crises at the moment during the vacuum of, U.S. leadership and the rise of Russia and Iran. So how does the power balance in the Middle East is helping Turkey to pursue that policy?
Well, Turkey is a very powerful country anyway. I mean, it was anyway a very important country for NATO or historically. I mean, but I think Turkey has realized, or at least the leadership has realized, that one way in the current last 10 or 20 years to kind of exploit the weakness, say, of the weakening structure of the United States in the Middle East is that what you do is not only do you make threats, but you also just do what you want and give countries a fait accompli. I think Turkey realized, for instance, the Mediterranean, that if it tried to negotiate with Cyprus, it wouldn't get what it wanted, but it might as well just claim that half the Mediterranean belongs to Turkey. And then the same thing occurs in northern Syria, where Turkey for many years was saying, well, we're going to do this or that. I think eventually they realized, well, if we just invade these areas, eventually we'll get to have them anyway. So it seems that Turkey has learned, and I think Turkey has modeled its behavior a bit off of Russia and Iran, realizing that countries that are emerging powers, including also, I think, China and the South China Sea, Turkey thought, well, these are the countries actually that are more successful. Whereas what happens with European countries or the United States is the more you threaten them, the more you get. And anyone who watched the Iran deal understood the United States, the more that you threaten the United States, the more the United States is willing to give you, because it doesn't want conflict. So if you're willing to call people's bluffs, I mean, obviously Cyprus and Greece and NATO, and none of these countries want conflict. So if you're just willing to say, okay, we'll just buy Russian S-400s, I mean, of course the Americans will condemn you in some statement. But if you correctly understand that statements are primarily meaningless and that the United States president will come and go every 4 or 8 years, I think Turkey thinks that it will succeed. And it also succeeds in playing off these countries amongst each other. It knows that the Russians and NATO are kind of bidding to see who can get Turkey's friendship. So as opposed to Turkey needing to beg to be in the EU or something, it wants to turn the tables and force the EU to beg it.
And my last question is, over the weekend, Turkey started sending drones to Cyprus. Turkish parliament approved an agreement with Libya for military cooperation, and today the Greek press was reporting that the Greek government was afraid that Turkey will start sending ships to these new expanded maritime boundaries, which ignores the territorial waters of Greek islands. And so now there are concerns that this escalating situation in East Mediterranean can turn into a military conflict. Do you think that constant crisis strategy can reach up to that point, to a military confrontation, which will involve nearly all parties around all countries around the East Mediterranean?
I don't think there could be a military conflict because every country around Turkey is afraid of Turkey. So that's what you saw, for instance, with the Turkey threats to invade Syria that got the Americans to leave. I mean, when in history has a country basically told the Americans, listen, you're going to have to leave, or we're going to take over your base, or this or that? So I think in the Eastern Mediterranean, Turkey will basically do whatever it wants. I don't think that Greece is not going to challenge Turkey. Israel is not going to challenge Turkey. Cyprus is not going to challenge Turkey. What they're going to do is they will take Turkey to some sort of international legal framework, which is what Turkey wants anyway, because if you go to some international court, there will be 10 or 20 years of negotiations. And at the end of the day, there will be some sort of compromise where if you ask for 100% and you only get 50%, you still win, because the Turks never even had all of the area that they wanted. And now they will say, yeah, but it's okay, we got half of this. We didn't even have half of it before. So I think they're gambling on that fact. And they watched what China did in the South China Sea, which is China just built airstrips on a bunch of islands. And even though the Philippines and Japan were saying, well, we should have a discussion about this, if you just go out there and you drill and do things, eventually you'll get what you want. So I think that Turkey is gambling on that. And I think it gambles on the fact that there's no country in the region that wants a conflict. Because countries these days, this isn't 1914. Nobody wants real conflict. People prefer to fight against insurgents or something like that.
Mr. Frantzman, thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone for listening to us. Goodbye.